Welcome to today's webinar. It's going to be just a chat, no formal presentation on a revisit of our discussion on sovereignty. The news out of this week highlighted that Canada is under siege, not just from within, given the outstanding and long-standing issues that we've been facing, whether it be East versus West or French versus English. We've also got the challenges, not just from the South, we've got China and the West, we've got Europe on the East drawing us in, we've got Russia in the North. So no matter which way you look, the calls for leadership is who can lead us and where out of this complexity that we have. And I'm hoping just to have an open discussion. It clearly is triggering emotions, but with this network, I often get more than emotion. I get some real thinking. So I'm hoping that some of you will ask good questions and have a few comments to make. So
the challenges to our sovereignty are significant. I'm not sure how to quantify them, but on a scale from 0 to 10, I think we are probably at an 8 or thereabouts. And I would say 5 years ago, we probably were at a 3 or at a 4. Now, those are very qualitative measurements. Unlike what happened in the past, threats to our sovereignty are now coming, or challenges to our sovereignty are coming from outside the country more than from inside the country. We all know and remember the Quebec referendum, but that's now several decades ago. And what we're now facing is quite different. The threats are from the inside, but our ability to deal with the threats are very much dependent on what we do or don't do inside our country.
Yes.
I think we have made ourselves too dependent on others, particularly when it comes to markets. And undue dependence is never a good position to be in. I don't think we made ourselves dependent deliberately. I think we've made ourselves dependent more by default or by attrition or by a series of small steps. But a large number of small steps can result in a very large problem, and that's what we have. The most obvious and outside visible issues are right now economic ones. Less visible are military issues. There are security in the sense of cyber issues that are emerging. But I think most of our problems are of an economic nature. And I think most of them, or many of them, are self-inflicted, mainly because we haven't taken the proactive steps to deal with them. The most overt signals to demonstrate that relate to our very modest gain in productivity, which manifests itself in so many parts. So we might want to have a discussion here today about what is actually meant by productivity and how much we have to pay attention to it. I think a lot is manifested by a lack of investment, but that's very closely tied to productivity. And I would say that a lot of it is attributed to the fact that our education system has been weakened and eroded in a major way. And when I speak about the education system, I don't mean just the K-12 system. I don't even mean
Jocelyn LaPointe, FaceTime video.
Just the K to university system, because there's a lot of education that takes place beyond graduating from university, whether you graduate with a master's degree or a bachelor's degree or a doctoral degree. But the ability to learn and to adjust and take the appropriate action is not as great as it needs to be in the Canadian population as a whole. We have a decline in productivity, or we haven't had market access. The other point I would make is that even though we are a trading nation, our trading partners are small in number and do not reflect the global nature of the world. I mean, our trading relationships, and I use the term trading in a broad sense, not just goods, but also services and connections and collaborations. For example, with Latin America, except for the mining sector, is really weak. Our connection to Africa is really weak. They have large populations, they have large young populations, and they are part of our future markets for goods and services. It's one thing to list a number of issues that we are facing, and no doubt you can add to them, to the ones that I've just stated. The real issue is, what do we do about them? And while I don't think this afternoon we can be prescriptive by saying this is exactly what we can do, I think we can give directional insight what needs to be done. And it relates more to the question of how to make the progress that we want to see happening, and the highly specific aspects around it. And I hope to hear from you what you think some of the approaches might be that we should consider. I think this is very timely because we are in an election phase or pre-election phase right now. I want to hear from political leaders what they think. I want to hear from members of parliament who are standing for membership in parliament, what they think. And I'd like to hear from us, what do we want to tell them?
Well, you've touched on many aspects of this elephant that we're trying to understand. You've stayed out of the personality of the South, which is where so many of the pundits and so many of those that are just reactive go, is to get into as if we're negotiating with an idiot. The reality is, and I think Bill, you said this numerous times in our sovereignty dinners, you may be dealing with a personality, but you've got to take them seriously. And that's when you're dealing with what's going on in the South. But it's not just the South, as you pointed out. It's the East, West, and the North, and then it's the internal issues. And with an election coming, we have an opportunity to get word out to our politicians of what we want to see Canada do, not only with others, but to itself. The issues are now economic and recognized as economic, and I don't think anybody any longer believes that the economy is going to take care of itself, which was sort of the mantra for several generations now. One of the mantras that I have heard is USA, USA, USA. Every time I watch a sporting event, I'm waiting for Canadians to say, no way, USA. And that seems to be one of the first reactions, is to people simply reflexing without thought on whether or not there may be opportunity here, which I hear Danielle Smith often articulating as things that we might make a silver lining out of this. And as you've alluded to, Axel, addressing some of the issues finally that have been ignored for so long. So Eric, you've got your hand up.
We talk a lot about the economic side of it. And I think one of the pieces that we're really missing is the security side of it. Because you have a lot of money in your pocket if you don't take care of the security side. And I don't just mean military, I mean intelligence gaps, I mean policing gaps. All of those things go together so that you aren't an easy target for somebody to come along and roll you. And whether that's the Americans or the Indians or the Chinese or whoever it is, you have to have both security and economics together. Otherwise, you're not going to be in a good position. So we keep saying economy, economy, economy. We have to think more about security, and that's not just military. From when I say we're weak on the military, we're weak on intelligence. We have a lot of holes on foreign interference. We have a whole bunch of issues on how our legislative and policing goes together. So there's a lot of gaps. And when you have somebody pushing and hitting you in the gaps, then of course we're going to have problems. And we don't seem to have a good language to articulate how we're going to fill those gaps in a coherent fashion.
But I mean, what you're basically saying is we haven't even acknowledged those as issues over the last 10, 15 years. I mean,
no, we're not. And I don't think we have a language to talk about them. It's one of the reasons why I keep harping on like the 19 hybrid warfares, and I think it's 5 overt warfares for conflict, because that at least gives us a language to look at the whole problem, where economics is only part of the issue. But if we're not prepared to talk about it and deal with the gaps, we're just going to keep having holes.
okay, so we've got defense on the table, military and in fact, just security itself. Eric Newell, you're
Okay, yeah, no, first of all, Perry, I want to just acknowledge, I guess it's whether it's you or whoever helped write that, summary of our current situation. I thought it was very brilliant. I shared it quite broadly with people, not on the basis I wanted to get a debate going. I just thought it was tremendous food for thought. And a lot of that's being reinforced by the commentary here. It is, we are facing a very tough time, and we have a threat of our sovereignty, and we have a number of issues. And basically, I would agree with those that are saying it's mostly self-inflicted. But one of the parts that got me going, and that's what I came back to you with, Perry, is that some of it, the integration or collaboration with our partners to the south just makes good economic sense. And it's been tried. I don't know how successfully, but the one big example we had was, and I was involved in it because at the time, this is when Ralph Klein had first come in, so it's back in the early 90s, and I was co-chair of the Alberta Economic Development Authority, along with Doug Mitchell and Charlotte Robb, and of course the Premier. But one of the initiatives that was quite interesting, I got involved in quite heavily, especially through not only that role, but also through our Alberta Chamber of Resources, was the Pacific Northwest Economic Region. And it'd be interesting if I could get a show of hands of how many people have even heard of that. But it had quite a good following, and it was based on just logical common sense. It wasn't as political as it sounds. It wasn't political in nature, but the Pacific Northwest Economic Region got spawned by the governors of 5 states and the premiers of 2 provinces, saying that, we have so much in common with the economy, and barriers, if we could just break it down, we'd have the huge multiplier effect of an economic prize. And the 5 states were Alaska, Washington State, Oregon State, Idaho, and Montana. And the 2 provinces, you might have guessed Saskatchewan. It wasn't. It was BC and Alberta. And so we actually had it working on a number of working groups and working several different areas, whether it was transportation or whatever. It was just, and the reason we did it is because when you added up the GDPs of those 7 entities, it would equal the the ninth largest country in the world, if it were a country, or from the interests of the 5 American states, it would equal California, which used to always sort of exert its influence over it. So it wasn't a Canada or Canada West versus Canada East thing at all. They did have a political entity like that at the time. And again, it would be interesting to see by show of hands who would even remember it. And that was Cascadia. And it had political ramifications. They were actually looking at, should we have more than just economic ties? But we weren't looking at that. And we had some good people involved. Jim Horseman, many of you may remember Jim. He was a longtime MLA, quite a leader in the party. But Jim was also chancellor of University of Lethbridge. He was a great community leader, and Jim became quite a champion. I kind of lost touch with it over time, and I was asking because Perry twigged it with this article, and that's what got me thinking, well, we had the model. Is it still going? I found out, I Googled it, they have the annual 2025 summit for Pinwar, so I guess it's still going. But so my questions started to be, well, if it was so common sense, well, why didn't we live up to our potential? Like, first of all, does it still exist? I didn't even know that answer. I guess it does still exist. But at the time, we thought it had a lot of really good potential. And so one of my questions is, without political concerns around sovereignty and tariffs from Donald Trump or whatever you want to call it, why didn't that just take off on its own? And it was the timing just wrong, or maybe it is. So at any rate, there are natural reasons or ways that we can collaborate. This doesn't have to be a totally negative thing. So I would just plant that one seed.
Okay, well, I'm going to interrupt there, Eric. You brought up the theme of leadership, and the question is always, where is that leadership going to come from at a time that we're being challenged today? We look to the fact we've got an election underway of whether or not our federal government can get involved, and that raises the question of role clarity. We've had the federal government heavily involved in a lot of provincial affairs over the last 20 years. But you would think that the federal government would be attending to the international issues, and we would let the provinces work out their interprovincial issues. And maybe we got a role issue here for the Senate, where you've got equal representation by the provinces, which we don't have right now, with Quebec and Ontario dominating the discussion, and undermining people's faith that even with the federal election that we're going to get a resolution of some of the issues that are prevailing. But you have triggered the question of leadership, and hopefully we'll get some answers whether or not the 2 leaders that are running or the 3 have an answer for the complex of questions we've got coming forward. I'm going to leave that for Bill to answer. Bill, you got your hand up. Go ahead.
I was just about Penwar. I attended the group last year in 2024. It's still going quite strong. I'm expected to attend again this year and get the information of how they're going to deal with the current administration in the United States. No doubt it's thrown a wrench into the Penwar concept. I don't think it's derailed it, because that group is very strong in understanding their economic connections. But it'll be a very interesting meeting this year. And I do suggest anyone who's interested in the U.S. Western Canada trade, that's well worth attending that seminar and group over the few days.
Since there's some people that haven't been here before, Bill, could you elaborate a little bit more? This Fortress North America is a broader concept than simply Fortress America, which seems to be one of the ideas that people have of what's driving Trump in the South. What is this Fortress North America all about?
So there's no doubt the current administration is retracting the U.S. hegemony worldwide and pulling it back to the United States. They simply can't afford policing the world anymore. That's not to say they can't interfere or project power anywhere in the world as they wish. They will absolutely be able to continue that, but they're going to have to reevaluate on an economic basis of doing that. It's just far too expensive. So the United States, as we've seen with their policies, is drawing industry, commerce, economics, and political alignment back to the core of the United States continental. And the position that Canada is in, is that a continental move, or is it a simple national move of the United States? So Fortress North America engages Canada, Mexico, and the continent of the United States into a coherent economic and security regime, alignment of policies, political policies, economic policies, and security policies. Now, the United States absolutely does not need Canada, but obviously Canada is significant in supporting that. So we certainly, America can certainly cut us off and let us go on our own, and they will be fine, though not great. And I think that's really a lot of the discussion here is, can the Americans afford not to have Canada? Absolutely they can. Will it hurt the United States? Absolutely it will. But the Americans will suck it up and cut Canada off if we don't align with them politically and economically. My argument is a Fortress North America, which stretches from the Arctic Circle all the way to the Panama Canal. Now, obviously, my concern is not Mexico, but more Canada and more specifically Alberta. And I think it is vital that Canada and especially Alberta align with the United States political and economic desires as the geopolitical situation on the globe is moving forward here. We're going to be a multipolar world. I think the Americans are not going to care about Europe, limited care about Asia, except for China and its reach beyond its shores. And Canada either joins or gets pushed aside. And this belief that we can join with the EU or the European concerns and align with Europe against the United States betrays a fundamental flaw in that we're separated by a massive ocean. And without the United States guarding our merchant fleets and our trade routes, Canada, whether we join the European model or not, would be isolated from the European economy just simply by that fact. So I think, given what I just read about Carney, more or less throwing our relationship with the United States into the trash bin is an incredible misstep. And Perry and I had talked about that. I had said that the reaction of Canada would either be infantile or adult, and I doubted that the adults are actually in the room and sitting in the big chair. Initially, I had to pull back a little bit because I thought Canada was doing pretty good in balancing the U.S. administration's aggravations. But given Carney, I can see Carney is the child in the room and thinks that Europe's going to come and save Canada. So I'm right back where we were about 2 months ago, Perry.
Well, unfortunately, it's been so typical for Canada to relate to the United States as if somehow it needs to define itself as different, as opposed to recognizing some of the phenomenal cultural, social, and economic advantages that Canada has as a nation, which seem to go unrecognized when we want to define ourselves as something which we are not, when in fact, from a defensive point of view, we have huge advantages for helping the United States. From an economic point of view, we've got resources, fourth largest source of oil and gas in the world. We've got the boreal forests in the north, which remain literally unexplored from a perspective of mining, water, forestry, you name it. Canada has so much to offer as an economic force and as a defensive force to the United States, and we don't seem to want to present ourselves as anything other than we are not the U.S. Seems to me if Canada is going to make a difference, it's got to pivot and pivot off that perspective and start to think about the fact that we are a North American force and that we need to be recognized by the US for what we have as economic advantages, not with a huge population, meaning market, but huge resource opportunities. I'm going to call on David Redmond next. David, you're up.
So folks, I've written a couple of papers, but if I can start high and work down. When I was an officer cadet in the Royal Military College of Canada back in the 1970s, we were taught a lesson that we had to take compulsory before we graduated, because as an officer in the Army, you had to represent Canada. And the presentation was on the 6 national interests that define a nation, and in particular, Canada. The 6 are unity, national security, good governance, rights and freedoms, economic prosperity and growth, and personal and community well-being. And in the last one, you cover both academia and the healthcare system. So those 6 national interests, I wrote a paper on it, it's called Canada 2024. It's on Frontier Center for Public Policy. It breaks those out in detail and talks about re-engaging the senior political class in our country to be forced to define what their stand is on every one of those 6 national interests, and have Canadians involved and re-energize our country. Because as I say very clearly in the paper, in the last decade, we have watched every one of those 6 be destroyed by the current government in power. Unity, national security, good governance, rights, freedoms, economic prosperity, growth, and personal and societal well-being. So that's kind of the high-level picture. The whole discussion about national security, just last week, I did a full-hour session with ROSI, the Royal Alberta United Services Institute, on national security and the Canadian Armed Forces. I put all this stuff in the chat if you're interested. And national security, as quite rightly pointed out, it's made up of intelligence services, border services, immigration services, protection of critical infrastructure, police services, the judiciary, emergency management services, alliance and partnerships, and the Canadian Armed Forces as the force of last resort to back all of those above up. And we haven't had a serious discussion about national security in this country since Perrin Beatty did a white paper that unfortunately was never published. So I think we need to think bigger than just the economy. We need to have a discussion about all 6 national interests, pull the essence out of each one of them if we're going to rebuild our country credibly. And I can't agree more with Bill Jones in terms of Fortress North America. If you go to my ROSI presentation, it's online. You can see in the Q&A, we got very detailed down into it. And my whole point is geopolitics defines any nation's national security. And when you share a continent with the world superpower, it is absolutely ridiculous to pick a fight with them, number one. And number two, we have a long history of collaborating on the defense of North America. And I also agree with Bill that we need to be looking from Panama Canal to the Arctic and how we build that. And I lay out a very detailed step-by-step plan on how to rebuild the Canadian Armed Forces, but as part of all of national security, starting with our intelligence services and taking them seriously, and then working down that list that I discussed, from intelligence to border to immigration. Because our immigration services is what's causing the protests and marches in our streets, which shows that the enemy is now within, not just outside on our coastlines. And until we take every piece of national security seriously, out of the 6 national interests, the top 2, unity and national security, are the overarching ones. You need economic and prosperity and growth. Obviously, they all 6 interrelate. But if you don't have unified citizens that are prepared to defend your borders, you don't have a country.
So are you optimistic, David?
Only if we see the Conservatives win the next election. If we get another 4 years with Carney at the helm, with the WEF as his mandate, he will finish the destruction of Canada. And I believe you will see a very serious sovereignty movement in the province of Alberta, and the country fracture smaller and smaller. And then let's be very serious. The United States cannot allow communist China to take hold of any jurisdiction in Canada. They will ultimately be forced to use more than economic power if we fragment and if we become a huge challenge to their national security. And so my whole discussion is, I don't care about Trump. Folks, I really don't. Until Canada takes itself seriously, no one in the world will take us seriously. And until we can actually show that we're a reliable ally and partner in all 6 of our national interests, then the United States is quite right to do whatever it does. And remember, Trump's old. He'll die, or there will be a change in administration, and every 4 years they have a change in administration. But the essence of the national interests of Canada will be defined for the next 50 years. And in the paper, I say there has to be a 25-year vision for our country, because we didn't get here overnight, and it's going to take at least a decade to walk us back out of it. But if we don't start now, there won't be anything to walk and protect in the future.
I appreciate you raising your hand for the Conservatives, but I need to challenge, and it's why I asked you that question, whether either one of the leaders today and any leader in Canada today is talking about unity as an issue. Our East-West divide is massive. Our economics versus social engineering is massive. Our issues of urban versus rural is massive. Our recognition of the importance of the military versus not is massive. These are significant cultural differences that have redefined or defined a nation that seems to be adrift.
I
So
wouldn't say it's adrift. I would say it has intentionally been destroyed for 10 years. If you look at the actions of the current Liberal government, the Liberals were never like this before, but the current Liberal government is intentionally destroying unity. And I can tell you how. They are intentionally destroying national security. They are intentionally destroying good governance, because in good governance is a right-sized civil service. It is an open and transparent set of elected officials. It is a properly run judiciary. There are so many pieces in each of them that they have attacked directly, our economic prosperity and growth. So without a change, and Carney has made it very clear that he's got the whole same team behind him. They intend to carry on with exactly what they've been doing. And while Poilievre may not be the greatest light bulb for the future of our country, the mistakes he will be unintentional, not intentional, in my opinion.
So what you're challenging is the postmodernism agenda that Trudeau put forward, the neoliberal perspective that we don't need borders. We need to think of ourselves as one global nation and take down our borders and take down our relevance as, quote, a nation, and not even celebrate July 1st. I'm going to go to Benita.
I just wanted everyone to know that the Independence for Alberta movement is alive and well. There's a group called Alberta Prosperity Project that just hosted a press conference in Calgary yesterday with very good attendance. And they're speaking about how they're sending a group down to Washington to talk about the United States, about the ways they may support Alberta independence. My understanding of this group, the Alberta Prosperity Project, is they intend to move forward with the Alberta independence movement. They're pushing for a referendum to happen this year on Alberta independence. It may happen as early as October 20th, along with our municipal council and school board elections. And they are pushing forward with this no matter who is elected at the federal level. So even if we get Conservatives at the federal level, that's the plan, is to move forward.
Before you go, let me ask you a question. If Alberta were to declare its independence or move in that direction, can Canada survive? Given that 25% of the economy in Canada is apparently financed out of Alberta, can this nation, it might have been able to weather the loss of Quebec, but could Canada as a nation survive Alberta leaving? Anybody have a Bojangles, Rob Engers? Can you respond to that?
Sure. Well, I think that in the short order, Alberta will become the 3rd largest province population-wise. I was shocked to see where BC had lost 400,000 and Alberta had come up, and or there were only 400,000 difference now. I mean, in my lifetime, I never thought we'd see Alberta outgrow British Columbia, but I think it could happen in short order. We cleared the highest amount of corporate paper outside of Toronto. Had we brought in no income tax scenario, which Richard Magnus wanted to do when he was MLA for Calgary North Hill, I think we would have seen a tremendous amount of flight of capital out of Ontario to Alberta. If I can, I'd like to address like a whole bunch of the other issues that were kind of raised. People talked about the external threats. I think obviously China, obviously Russia, but I want to point out what I think are two. One, the jihadist threat of radical Islam, I think, is becoming more and more an internal issue. Trudeau's riding in Papineau has the highest Muslim population in all of Canada, and that's driven some of his policies with regard to the Muslim Brotherhood and Omar al-Gabra and various things. The other one that I haven't heard anybody talk about, but I'm going to, because I think it's an issue, is the LGBT or the transgender stuff. I think that's been a greater threat in subversion to the country, even in some of our foreign entities. But anyhow, I could go on about that. I think that as a country, we've made bad decisions on so many levels, like whether it was the wheat board in 1935 that meant that farmers weren't getting fair value and we were subsidizing China and Canada Steamship Lines and Paul Martin, with a monopoly contract, terrible decision. The Chicago Mercantile, was smaller than the Winnipeg Grain Exchange until we did that. Terrible decision. Pipelines, the idea that we haven't been able to get them to the coasts or to the north has been a travesty, not only for us, but for our allies, whether it's Japan or Korea or Germany, etc., whatever. Even under Diefenbaker, I'm a staunch conservative, but that we got rid of the Avro Aero program or didn't decide to become a nuclear power militarily when Doug Harkness was minister, etc. Those were things that hampered us in terms of our sovereignty and viability going forward. Under the Trudeaus, the gold's been sold off. Had we kept it, just what we had in the 1960s, we'd have the third largest gold reserve in the world, but we don't anymore, and we got nothing backing the currency whatsoever. One of 12 countries that has no bullion reserve whatsoever. POGI, we've been subsidizing socialism and lack of productivity in this country for decades, and we shouldn't have done it. We should have changed the system. We shouldn't have allowed that. We've eliminated the ports police that allows China free reign with regard to fentanyl and heroin and human smuggling and everything else that goes on. Democracy itself, we've allowed these electronic tabulators and moved away from having paper ballots and allowed the compromise of the chain of custody with regard to our elections. Every single leadership race for the Conservative Party and the Liberals since Trudeau and since Harper have all been done by Dominion voting systems. How do you expect to have fair elections? We've eliminated guns and done everything possible in this country to thwart gun ownership. And that's been one of the great strengths of the United States vis-a-vis a Japanese invasion in the 1940s, etc., was to have citizens that are armed. And then the Supreme Court, we've had tamperings with our Supreme Court since certainly Trudeau Sr., and even in Harper's time, every single person who decided who our Supreme Court justices were all LGBT activists.
We've had an activist Supreme Court now for what, 2 generations?
Yeah. So when you ask about the fix, that's a lot of belly aching about the problem. So I would say, when I was working with the National Citizens Coalition with David Somerville, he always maintained that we should have had a more overt political arm, that we should have exposed terrible candidates and run people against them to expose them for their connections to China, Russia, etc. That would have been a help. David did that to some extent with his book Trudeau Revealed and whatnot, but there needed to be more of that. I would also argue that, part of the strength of the World Economic Forum in terms of what they've done is there was a study that was done, and I'm trying to remember who originated it, but if you looked at the people who headed up campus political organizations, they often became the leaders of political parties a generation hence. And so the Fraser Institute Michael Walker did a great job of making sure that, young people in campuses were engaged in discussions about economics and learning about Milton Friedman and, et cetera, and Ludwig von Mises and Hayek and all these things. We need to have that in strat studies. It's pathetic that first off, we don't have as many people as the United States does with former military backgrounds in politics because we don't have as many people in the military. We don't allow the militaries on the campuses to recruit, etc. So we have people who really lack a lot of that understanding of geopolitics. And if we want to do it, even if they're not, serving in the military, then we need to have programs. You mentioned Ditchley, that's interesting. I'm not sure that the average kid on campus would be attracted to a placard saying Ditchley because they don't have the historical knowledge about, Churchill and Enigma and everything else that went on there. But if we have more strat studies that are reaching out to students and involving them, young political leaders, etc., I think that's part of the fix. Anyhow, that's my rant.
Well, you've touched on something that concerned me considerably, is the military as a career is not presented to Canadian youth.
No.
When you look at career planning in our high schools, it is very rare that a boy or a girl will think about the military as a place for career development, as a stepping stone to a career, as a place for a free education. Dawn, your turn.
Yeah, I've just got a few more things to add to the list in terms of observations, but I think our nation has been all about region building at the expense of nation building over our entire history. And I think that's why we find ourselves in this rather dysfunctional situation. But we've got incredible growth of government over time as well at the three levels, but particularly the federal. We've got an increasing dependence of the population on the government. And we've got, at the same time, real complacency about their performance and complacency about getting up out of our seats to listen to representatives and even vote. So I'm just wanting to highlight that. And I think I've always thought we've got a rather dysfunctional government at the federal level. I could never figure out why Quebec has got a party there, a federal party, and one that wants to separate from the rest of Canada. It just is so dysfunctional. Anyway, those are my additional comments about, I think, issues that could be addressed.
I mean, you're touching on fundamental flaws that may be inherent in the origins of the country itself. The French-English connection has never really been resolved. There have been some early attempts, but it certainly isn't. Well, maybe it's in keeping with the concept of multiculturalism under Pierre Trudeau as opposed to the melting pot. Eric, go ahead.
What I wanted to comment on was the Fortress North America. If we're not serious about our national security, how can we be serious about Fortress North America? And why would the Americans want us to be independent if we're not serious? Because we are a gap, and we're an opportunity for to be taken advantage of to get onto North America. So if we want Fortress North America, then that means that we need to change our perspective about all of national security and how we approach it and how we support it. Otherwise, there's no reason for them to take us seriously. And just going up and saying, yes, it's a really good idea for you guys, for us to be part of North America, when they're looking at us and saying, well, you guys haven't ponied up. Why would we want you? Now, that's not to be negative, because yes, we've done some great things over the years, but it's been since the 60s that we've actually taken security serious. And so we need to adjust our mindsets on what the threats are, because the oceans aren't as big of a barrier today as they were in the 1940s. Okay. And if we look at our economics, it's not all about resources anymore. If we're talking about IP as being the major force for the new economies as opposed to resources, we've got to take a different look at both economies and securities. And that's pretty much what I wanted to say in regards to Focus North America.
Well, Eric, I'm always looking for a title, a theme, a way to consolidate a lot of perspectives. The word seriously seems to be coming to the fore, and taking Canada seriously. It seems to me that Canadians haven't taken Canada seriously. Maybe they do when we have a hockey game, but when you look at the word dysfunctional, when you look at the disparity, east, west, rural, urban, things that Axel brought forth, the fact that so many of these issues, the interprovincial trade, have been outstanding for so long, it would not appear that our leaders have really taken the nation itself seriously. And abandoning the celebration of July 1st would be just another example. David, I think you've been echoing this sentiment. Go ahead.
Every discussion from each of the people that have just talked recently, the 6 national interests cover everything that we've talked. Right. And you can put them into each one of them, and we need to pull them apart and really look at them. Let's talk perhaps just for a minute on the Rossi presentation last week. I really went into detail and present a way ahead, a 3-year task force that would rebuild national security, focusing on the Canadian forces, but on all elements of it. And it's a step-by-step, and in the first 6 months, what has to be done, in the first 3 years, what has to be done, in the decade, what has to be done. Because if you don't have a detailed list of tasks given and tasks implied, you aren't going to get there, and a task force structure to do it. Because I worked on the task force on security for Premier Klein. I'd led it from September the 12th, 2001. And Paul Salucci and I met. Well, he was the American ambassador to Canada. We met one-on-one, just the two of us, for a 2-hour session. And he always started every presentation. You guys all remember him in the newspaper saying, security trumps trade. Well, let's talk about North America. And I was able to prove to him in 2003 that Alberta took security more seriously than the United States. And I briefed congressmen in their offices, senators in their offices in the United States, and Michael Chertoff one-on-one. And we as a country were taken seriously. So we can do this again. There's a step-by-step process, the task force process, one for each of the 6 national interests. So let's talk about enemy forces, because you always start an estimate of the situation with the enemy. And I'm very clear in the Rossi presentation, and I had a really good to and fro with some folk. Number 1 enemy, China. Time for us to reorient and look to the Pacific. Number 2 enemy is not Russia. It's the Islamic Revolutionary Guard that are marching in our streets, fully funded and paid for by China. Okay? They're in our country now. So we've got Chinese police stations in our country. We've got Chinese interfering daily in our election process, in our municipal order of government, in our schools. We've got the IRGC fully funded and operating in our country. When I ran counterterrorism in 2001, we were told flat out that Alberta was the largest fundraising center for ISIS and Al-Qaeda. All right? They're here. They've been here a long time. So number 1, China. Number 2, the IRGC. Number 3, Russia. And people challenged me and said, but we still have to be part of NATO. I said, perhaps, but it's Europe's job now to take care of Russia, not North America's job. And if they don't step up, that's their problem. But we have to take care of North America first while we're rebuilding, at least for the next 3 years, to be taken seriously, first of all, by our neighbors to the south, and then by the rest of the world. And I don't just mean in national security. I want a task force on the economy, too, to talk about resource revenues, resource industries, value-added industries, service industries, manufacturing, and how we're going to expand them with the task force with 3-year objectives so that we can afford and fund what we need to do. I heard the discussion from Don about management of risk, is the way I always call it. We had 20 years of helicopter parenting and 20 years of bulldozer parenting that have now produced people in their 40s and 50s that truly believe that all risk must be managed by government. They're not accountable for anything. They turn to the government to save them from everything. So 20 years of helicopter parenting produced parents that did 20 years of bulldozer parenting. And we have passed the understanding that risk is managed by the individual to the government. We have to walk that back. It won't happen overnight. It'll take at least a decade, but we need to recognize how we got here. And when COVID hit, everybody said, government save me, which was exactly the opposite of what we should have done. And you know, I've given presentations on COVID, perfectly timed. So multiculturalism was brought in by Trudeau Sr. for one purpose and one purpose only, in my opinion. It was to break English-speaking Canada into smaller and smaller groups. The regionalization, the entire pitting of different ethnic groups against each other. When government funds you to stay in your ethnic community, that's wrong. That's taxpayer dollars. I'm not a melting pot guy. I'm none of the above, but you do not encourage people not to come together, to join together. And so multiculturalism had one intent, and his son has taken it to the next level. And so my final point is on DEI and all of the other cancel culture movements. They are taking multiculturalism to another level, and DEI is just a tool in the attempt to break Canada into smaller and smaller and smaller groups and pit them against each other. Sorry.
Toward what end?
To try, in my opinion, to turn Canada into a post-national state with no culture, with no unity, no national security, no good governance, because at the end of the day, they don't want Canada as a nation to exist. And the WEF would love it if they had the perfect example. Now, it can't happen because the United States can't permit it to happen. They cannot allow this to sit on their northern border and allow access from Chinese influence, IRGC influence, Russian influence to come from north to south. So it's a fool's game, but Trudeau Jr. truly believes that Canada isn't a country.
So is your action plan accessible on the website, or?
Okay, so there's two papers, and both, I never present a challenge. I always present a challenge with the solution. So if you go to Canada, I put them in the chat, but
Okay.
Canada 2024, a strong, resilient nation or a fearful, fractured country. The first half defines the challenges and how we got here. And the second half includes a complete process, how to walk it back based on the 6 national interests. The second paper is Unfit for Duty, and it's on C2C Journal. It was just published in December, and it's the Rousey presentation I gave last week, both of which are also in the chats. Again, it presents where the Canadian Armed Forces and where national security is today, and a definitive 3-year plan based on task force structure to walk it back.
Excellent. Thank you. I'm looking for hands. Barry, you were smiling there. That doesn't mean you were raising your hand, but there was something there that was being touched on. And I know you have a strong perspective on the relevance of the relationship of Canada to China. We spent some time on that. You want to weigh in here?
Well, I would weigh in. We're 40 million people in such a huge country that nobody should have expected us to be able to govern it without these bumps and crises and whatever. My message has been for several years now that we were going down this road. We are going to bottom out. You always do in a crisis, and that you either fall apart or you solve and rebuild. And Canadians have traditionally done that. I don't think the average Canadian has any clue about what is being talked about here. And somehow we've got to get that dialogue going, because what's going to happen is you're going to see, if we don't, you're going to see Canadians do as they always have done, and that is go back to what they have done in the past, with people telling them they're going to get a different outcome than the outcome that continually happens. And we can't afford that anymore. So that's the kind of crisis we have in front of us. We got to solve it by being, we've got to be economically viable.
Is Canada economically viable without Alberta?
Southern Ontario, that I grew up in, felt they were and still do feel that they are economically viable without the rest of Canada. So I don't know whether that's the answer you're looking for, but
I'm not sure it's an answer to the question. Is Canada economically viable if Alberta's revenues are not contributing to Canada's needs? That is, the supporting of its pension system, of the needs for resource distribution. Alberta is a major contributor to Canada's welfare. If Alberta does not exist, does Canada exist? We can live without Quebec.
well, my answer would be Alberta and Quebec together, I think, are probably the solution to turning the Titanic around and keeping it afloat. And my experience has been that the Quebecois are concerned about the Quebecois, and Albertans are concerned about Albertans. And when they get their heads together, then they can bring the rest of the country along. And so therefore, I'm not at the point where I would even think about acknowledging that there's much of a chance of Alberta stepping back and trying to do it ourselves. If we were where this port is, it would be a different story. But landlocked, all we'd be doing is what the Americans are doing right now, and that's destroying themselves, setting themselves up to fall apart themselves. So,
well, a question that I have, and I'll look for an answer. Maybe Rob, you would have, or David. The word ignorant. We have an election coming. We don't have anybody running on a platform of unity that I know of. They all seem to say, yeah, we're going to fix the interprovincial trade, but the issues are much grander than that. If we're going to reinvent or rediscover or revitalize Canada as a nation, we need leadership, but we also need an instrument. If the public isn't aware of the issue, somebody's got to step forward, either CBC, our education system. Where is that instrument of change going to come from if it isn't going to come from the leaders in a federal election?
where it's coming from now, Perry, is social media.
That's my concern.
Yeah.
It's chaos and it's reflexive. Go ahead, Bill.
So is Canada viable without Alberta? Well, it's all by the definition of what viable means. They have the population mass to have an economy, and certainly based on that, absolutely viable. Will it be at the standard of living that they are working under? No. They will have a drop in standard of living. It'll take time for them to recover, depending on their choices of where they want to economically trade with, whether it's Europe, United States, or Western Canada. So yes, it's absolutely viable. Is Alberta viable as a landlocked? Absolutely. Our trade does not go east-west, it goes north-south, and we definitely would operate well within the American sphere of resources down south, products come north, and that wouldn't change very much. I'm, to be upfront and clear, I am an Alberta independence and person. I operate one of the parties of independence here in Alberta, and I've got lots of material about landlock, and it's not an issue at all. There's many landlocked countries that do very well, Switzerland being one of them, that do very economically well. But I'm not going to get into that. But so the question is will Canada wake up? It is very unlikely. And again, Perry and I have debated publicly and privately about this. The political force in Canada is the Laurentian corridor. The economic power is in the west, primarily Alberta. And there is no way the political force will surrender their political desires and wants in favor of the economic region. So that it is an intractable problem. Alberta needs more political power to reflect their economic power, and the East, holding the political power, will never release it. No one gives up political power. So I see no solution as much as the very great wisdom everybody puts out here in saying, is there a leader out there to do it? The fact is, Poilievre, he's a Westerner, he's a Calgarian, he understands the Western issues quite well, but he realizes he cannot get government unless he appeals to the Laurentian corridor. And there's no way he can alter the fact that the governments get elected out of that small little line from the point at Windsor all the way up to Montreal and Quebec City. So to believe that he will operate in a way that promotes the more equitable political structure throughout Canada will not fly with that particular political force. So he has to pander to that, no different than the Liberals. It's different, no doubt, absolutely different, but he has the political realities that he faces. So to see some change in Canada from where its momentum has gone for the last 40 years, 50 years, since I've recognized it when I was a young boy, I can't see it happening. And I do not see any leaders stepping up other than provincial leaders, such as our premier and Mo in Saskatchewan, and a little bit from Ford, to promote their own regional forces. Canada was built as a regional nation. The West was a colony. If you read the original treaties of Canada moving west, it was to exploit the resources of the West in favor of Canada. And Canada was defined as that Laurentian corridor. And that hasn't changed, and it won't change, since the political power has always rested in that region. I do not see much of a future as a unified country of Canada, maybe loosely like the EU or something like that. But I just do not see a way to take the intractable force of economics over here and political power over there. It's a one-way street, and I cannot imagine how that can be corrected.
Well, from what you said, I'm going to call on Axel to do a wrap up. From what you've said, Pierre, being from the West, may be more sympathetic and being conservative to the issues that we raised of economics, but needs to win an election, which means he's got to pander to the Laurentian corridor in Quebec. However, once elected, is he prepared to introduce a platform that is broader than what he is running for in an election? Okay, Axel, you started this discussion. Thank you very much. It's been richer than I expected, and I'm delighted with the turnout that we have today and the insights that we've gotten. Is there something you'd like to further contribute in a wrap up?
Well, yes, I want to bring up one point. We've spoken about our relationship with and to the United States on several occasions. I think we have to take into account, and this is consistent of taking charge of our own future, we have to take into account that the United States may become a failed state. I mean, that sounds extraordinary from some perspective, and I'm not forecasting it. I'm saying that you have to take that into account as you look at the steps that we should be taking. We really have to depend on ourselves first and foremost. We have to choose our partners, and we have to choose them wisely. And we have to take into account that some of these partners may change fundamentally. I mean, the Europeans discovered that. The people in the Middle East discovered that. if you look at history, either through the lens of the Soviet Union or more broadly and earlier through the lens of the Ottoman Empire, or if you go really much further back into history, the Roman Empire. So please don't mistake me. Please don't think that what I'm saying is that the US will become a failed state. I'm not saying that, but I think it may very well become a failed state, and we need to take that into account. It shows some of the attributes of a failed state today, but I would not extrapolate those to the US becoming a failed state.
Well, there are some that view that the current president is aware of that, and that is the panic and the behavior that he's demonstrating is in response to a concern that a $37 trillion deficit plus a $2 billion a year budget deficit is worthy of panic. And what we have is, for a state that is viewed as the champion of democracy, it's become very socialistic in since January. I mean, the decisions that are being made from the top to affect the lives of individual citizens is very representative of more of a socialistic or a democracy in panic mode.
Does everyone remember where they were very late October 1995? I was commanding a battalion in the middle of the former Republic of Yugoslavia, which was in a horrid and disgusting civil war. And around us every day, we watched a country ripping itself apart because groups of people within that country couldn't agree to carry on living. But what happened on the 30th of October in 1995 in Canada was the last referendum on independence that's been held recently for Quebec to leave our country. My battalion was 25% Quebecers. And we sat on a floor in a giant drill hall with the only little black and white TV we could find, with a satellite signal hooked up to it. And my entire battalion, less those on sentry duty and guard duty, keeping us from being overrun, watched as the results came in, and no one left till 4 o'clock in the morning when we realized we actually had a country to come home to. I want you to remember that civil wars never turn out the way you think they will. Separation of organizations and political entities never turn out the way you will. They always turn out much worse. I never want to see my country dissolved. My mother and father both fought in uniform in the RCAF in World War II to try and defend democracy and freedom. And to see it being eroded and destroyed in this country now rips my heart out. That's why I wrote the papers. Let's not have a civil war in Canada, because provinces separating, folks, it won't be easy, and people will be very angry. Hatred will run in our streets. It will be neighbor versus neighbor. It won't be easy.
Thank you. That's a wrap up of the recording.